Welcome back to the Ex-Foster Voice, where we represent the voices of those who have lived through the foster system. I'm Serena Vasudeva, ex-foster youth and your host. Today we'll be hearing from someone identified as Taylor. Now, Taylor has never been involved with the foster care system, but she adds a unique perspective to the inner workings of foster care. She has previously worked in a rehabilitation facility and an in-home care program, both of which used restraints. Even though her work there was with adults, children and teens in foster care can be sent to facilities which also use restraints. When you graduated with your degree in psychology, you were working in a gas station. Then you applied somewhere else. Tell me about it.
So I was working at a gas station Fridays, Saturdays in order to pay to get through college. When I graduated, I decided I wanted to do at least something associated with my degree. I was presented with the opportunity to work for an in-home care program for individuals with intellectual disability. I felt that this was at least tangentially related to mental health care, so I applied and I got the job. The work was going into people's homes who lived independently. They had their own apartments, and spending 8 hours at a time with them, helping them with what we call the activities of daily living. Cleaning, dressing, preparing food, getting to and from appointments, things like that. The thing that stands out to me most, though, is that they needed companionship. It struck me as a pretty lonely, isolated kind of life. So a lot of the job was just being there, interacting with somebody who didn't really have any other interaction with the world. The person to whom I was assigned had behavioral issues as well as intellectual disability, which meant that sometimes they could become violent. So part of the training, part of the preparation was knowing how to restrain them so that they didn't hurt anybody or get hurt themselves.
So, for someone who doesn't know, what is a restraint and why are they used?
So, my training, and I went through this training, I've been through it several times in my life at this point, was through a program called Nonviolent Crisis Intervention through the CPI Foundation, the Crisis Prevention Institute. That's what it was. And the holds that we were taught were, it's hard to describe orally, but imagine a sort of jujitsu hold where you're holding somebody's arm or holding their body in a way that immobilizes them, but doesn't put stress on their body in a way that harms them. Two kinds of holds that come to mind in particular. The first was sort of a control hold, which was kind of like an arm bar. You hold someone's arm, you pull it across your body, you grab their other wrist with your other hand, so you've immobilized both of their arms, and then because your hips are behind them, you can use your hips sort of doing a butt bump to move them around the space. And that immobilizes their arms so that they can't swing and throw punches, and it also allows you to move them into or out of a space. So away from other people or towards somebody else who can help you in a different way. And that's a way to keep them from swinging and maneuver them in the space without, putting them in like a choke hold or a bear hug or something like that. The other hold that comes to mind is a two-person hold in which you start with sort of this arm manipulation, and then another person comes in, grabs the opposite arm, and together you both put a hand on the person you're restraining's upper back and bend them forward over your hips and pull their arms around to your side so that they are sort of bent forward with their arms outstretched and again immobilized. The training for that includes the idea that you don't hold them in that for long, that they are more than likely going to go to ground. They're going to become dead weight and go to the floor to get out of the hold, and that you let that happen. Once they go to the ground, you let go. The idea is that they are being immediately dangerous and need to be immobilized that moment. And if they're on the ground, they are less likely to be physically dangerous. So the idea is that somebody is an immediate physical threat to themselves or others, and you need to keep them from hurting somebody. And you need a way to keep that from happening, so you physically restrain them long enough and in a soft enough way that harm comes to nobody.
I think it's really interesting what you said, though, about the dropping thing, where, like, if somebody goes to the ground, you let them go.
Right.
Because that is, I've never seen that happen. I've heard people, because obviously I was in a group home and they did restraints a lot. I've heard people say if you drop, they'll let you go. Never seen that. Because when I was in my restraint, I dropped, they kept holding me. I've seen people drop and get held. I've never actually seen anyone drop and then they let go and that's the end. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and I guess as part of our conversation, we're going to get into the failures of this kind of system. And one of the big failures is that you have people doing it.
A lot can go wrong when you're doing a restraint or hold, so you attended training. Tell me a bit about it.
So the training took place over the course of a day. A lot of it had to do with de-escalation tactics. So noticing when somebody is getting agitated and the situation is escalating to a point where somebody is going to become violent. There were videos. There was a workbook. There was a multiple choice test at the end. And then there were demonstrations of the holds. We went through several of them depending on what place you were in and what you were expected to do and the standards of the facility. What would happen is the facilitator, the instructor, would explain to you what the hold was and then demonstrate it with a facilitator. The instructor would, quote-unquote, restrain, show you how it's done on a facilitator, somebody else who is helping teach the course. And then everybody in the class would take turns doing it. This is good. Obviously, you want more than just being told and shown in a video. But something that needs to be kept in mind is that this is not a real-world situation. When you're walking through a hold like this, it doesn't feel real. It feels choreographed. It's very soft, very gentle, and you have the time to work through it. And if you've never done it before, that is a great place to start. The training takes place over a day, though, and then you're out on the floor. I have to give props to a few instructors who tried to make it as real as possible. When it was time for everybody to take a turn, restraining them, they said, okay, you're going to restrain me. I'm not going to make it easy on you. I'm going to behave in the way that somebody that we're giving service to is going to behave. And they fought and they struggled. And you did get a feeling for, yes, people are going to be resisting this, which is very important to understand. This is not a pleasant experience for anybody. They're not going to let you do this to them. But still, even then, there's this understanding that this isn't the real thing. Nobody is going to actually spit on you in training. Which has happened. You get spit on.
I've seen it happen too.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question. So
Sure.
You went through the Crisis Prevention Institution. That's the organization that teaches nonviolent crisis intervention, or NCI. It says on their website that they train professional on both restrictive and non-restrictive interventions. Those restrictive interventions being restraints, holds. What are the non-restrictive interventions that they teach?
That would be the de-escalation tactics that I mentioned. They teach there are several stages in a crisis. You can tell that somebody is agitated, in like they're restless, that kind of thing. And then it might escalate to like they're being verbally abusive, then escalate to actual physical aggression. The de-escalation tactic is being able to talk to somebody in such a way that it doesn't escalate. And that would be showing that you hear them, that you understand what's going on, that you want to help. Sometimes that doesn't work, but it is like people skills, like active listening, and yeah.
How frequently did you do sessions? Like, were there renewals? Did you do it like every 6 months? What was that process like?
At my first facility, you were trained upon hiring. I don't know if there was a renewal. I know that you get a sort of certification card, a blue card, and that does have an expiration date. At my second facility, there were refresher courses, I believe, every year.
So when you were providing in-home care, how often did you do restraints?
Well, I did it on the first day on the job. It wasn't that often. It was just one individual, and he was going through a particularly rough time. So this guy that I worked with, let's call him Clark. This guy was double-staffed. Instead of having one person assigned to him, there were two people, specifically because restraints were sometimes necessary. And I was taking the lead of the other veteran staff member, and we were out in public in a store, and he got upset. We used our 2-person hold. He went to the floor. We let go. He was crying. We managed to excuse ourselves and get out to the car and headed straight back to the apartment.
What happened after?
The rest of that shift, it was just kind of tense. I think we just sat and watched TV. At that job in particular, we had to take notes about everything that happened during the shift. And there would be pages and pages of handwritten, like, then this happened at 7:05 p.m., this happened. And you would have like an 8-hour log. And when there was something like that happened, it was like, you've got to sit down and write it down, like right now, while you remember what has happened.
How did doing restraints affect you?
It wasn't a pleasant experience. It was stressful to be in a situation where it was a mix between really chill and it's go time. And you didn't know when you went in that day whether or not somebody was going to get assaulted. Because you could get assaulted, but at the same time, you could be the person assaulting somebody. You are required by the job to put yourself in a position where somebody could hurt you, but you're also in a position where you might be required to put your hands on somebody and restrain them, and they are struggling and fighting. And we call it nonviolent. And relative to like UFC, yeah, it's not a knockdown, drag out brawl. We are not throwing punches at each other. The idea is to keep punches from being thrown, but you are holding somebody against their will. That is an antagonistic relationship, and it is not fun to do. I had a very unpleasant time in these positions. I had nightmares. My anxiety spiked. Yeah, it was not great.
So tell me about the nightmares.
I'm thinking of one specific nightmare. At this first position, like I said, you go into an apartment, somebody's living independently, and you help them with the activities of daily living. And then after 8 hours or so, somebody else comes in, you clock out, you leave. The dream was I went to work. I did my job. And then when it came time for the end of my shift, somebody else came in And I went to leave, and they said, no, you're the client. You don't get to leave. You're the one who is stuck here, and we are watching you. The sense of isolation and being cut off and looked down on was a nightmare. That's probably more revealing about my own psychology and my own relationship to what we were doing, what I was being paid to do, and my own attitudes, I guess, internalized towards the clients. Now that I think about it, like it was just a role reversal. And if that's how I felt that other people were going to be treating me, well, I guess that means that that's how I was treating them. That's not a good feeling. I don't know how generalized that feeling would have been amongst other people who were working the job.
It sounds like it definitely affected you, like, big time.
Yeah, I made a conscious choice to not do that kind of job anymore. Part of me believes that something like it is necessary, that there are people who need community support, but the dynamics of that job and the fact that it was a job, like you clock in, you do the job, and you clock out. Like, it's very impersonal. Like, imagine if your mom was only there for 8 hours at a time, and you knew that she was only there because she was getting paid, and that you were just a job. And this is not the question that you've asked, but since we're talking about it being just a job, it's not a well-paid job either. This first gig that we've been talking about, I was paid minimum wage. And I'd like to remind you that you are being paid minimum wage to walk into a situation for 8 hours at a time where you are expected to be physically confronted, where you might actually get physically hurt. I'm worried about my insurance outside of this, and I'm going to a job where I might be assaulted. I think when I got out of this business, I was being paid like $12 an hour. So yeah, if you want somebody to do this very important, necessary kind of work, that doesn't seem like enough money to get people who are going to do that job well.
So, how restrictive was this in-home community place? Was it like people could go take a walk if they wanted to? Like, give me sort of an example, or...
Yeah, it depended on their level of function, their functioning level. If somebody they just needed some help with everyday activities every now and then yeah, they could go on a walk on their own. But for the most part, there needed to be a staff member with you. You go on a walk, staff members coming on a walk with you. You go visit a friend, staff members coming. And these are individuals who can't drive. The staff member is responsible for that. For Clark, it was 2 people.
So around 2015, you started working for the Fairfax Center as a rehab aide. Tell me a bit about Fairfax.
There were a mix of people, all the way from people confined to bed, to a wheelchair with a feeding tube, to individuals who were barely impaired at all, who just needed somebody to check in on them. And they needed a place to live with support while they worked on their therapy. And within 6 months, they were back living an independent life. The population specifically that I worked with were, in the beginning, physically unimpaired, but with behavioral issues. I keep using this term, behavioral issues, as though people know what it means. What it means is people with a habit, a predilection, whatever, to be, I guess, antisocial in one way or another, either physically or verbally aggressive. For some of these individuals, there was a choice to be made, presented to them, to either go to prison for something they'd done, or to go to rehab, where they would live at this facility for an indefinite period of time and undergo therapy. There were plenty of people who were not their own guardian. These were all adults, and there was a lot of talk about like getting your guardianship back so that you could make the decisions about whether or not you stayed here. Otherwise, it wasn't up to you. It was up to somebody else.
And sort of drawing this back to foster care and residentials and group homes, there's not really much of a choice there either. I think probably in your experience, there was a more majority, or in your experience, there was probably a lot more people who had agreed. In my experience, it was a lot less. It was very much like you kind of just ended up there out of circumstance, either because you had a behavioral issue, you didn't have another place that would take you, you were in between places, you had just come out of juvie. It was sort of a mixing pot of different people.
I was actually looking at my resume the other day, and the last time I had updated it was somewhere, I think 2020, and I described Fairfax as an adult foster care facility. So I don't know. That seems pertinent. They did, like I said, there were people who didn't have their guardianship, and Fairfax was like the place that they were placed.
And then the interesting thing about these, at least foster care facilities, is not everyone who is in these residentials and group homes, and this is something I don't think a lot of people understand, have necessarily a clinical reason to be there. So a lot of people, they're either really small and insignificant, so it's, you just have like a very minor cognitive issue that could easily, like, that's not why you shouldn't be locked up for that, So a lot of the times it's like really high functioning people, or people who are literally just like, well, I don't have another place to go. So that's just kind of the way that it works, which is very interesting. It's interesting because you get in this loop where it's like you have something that's minor that makes it so it's hard for you to place. Like if you have a mental disability, a cognitive disability that just requires a bit more care from a foster parent, but then obviously your foster parents aren't trained and they don't know how to manage it. They might have their own issues that they're working with, and that comes out. You have substandard care, which is care that isn't good enough, right? And then you have a disruption, and it gets harder to get placed back, and then you get put in a residential, right? Which is a very high-level facility, and foster parents look at that, and they don't want a kid from a residential because there is a image of what someone in a residential looks like. Mm-hmm. And so it then becomes harder to get out of there, even though you were in there for just something that's so small and insignificant that you don't need staff members. You just need a little more help from your foster parents. Or you might not even need that at all. It's just, I'm waiting to become 18 so I can have a voice and I can put my say on things that I want and things that I need.
Something that occurs to me hearing you say that, and I don't know if this is pertinent, but the idea that the reason that you're placed in this facility is very minor. I said that for some people it was a choice between jail or this. Drug offenses were a thing, were a reason why some people were there. And there were some individuals that it occurred to me, wow, like there are people walking the street who are out there living full and happy lives. You're on the same level. It's just that you smoke pot and the cops got called. You're fully capable of being out there, but there was this judgment made about one aspect of your behavior, that people who are very much almost identical to you are still out there living their lives. And that kind of that bugged me. I'll say that haunted me. I don't do drugs, but like I don't think that it's something to lock somebody up for. I think that it depends on how your behavior is. And the one person in particular that I'm thinking of, it really was like, why are you here? Like, I have friends back home who you would hang out with, and it would be fine. You would be great. You would be perfectly functional. But if we're talking about like people who didn't choose to be here, this is one reason why they were there, and it is like an unjust type of thing. Because then we do have to say that these people are in a situation where it's not jail. Jail is going to be infinitely worse for this, but they are in a situation where there are people who are empowered to restrain them, to like put their hands on them, to limit their freedom for some bullshit.
How was Fairfax organized?
There were 4 units on campus, basically dormitories. 2 of them were for people who were medically impaired. And then there was what we called the behavioral unit. And when somebody did intake, when they came into the facility, that's the unit that they would go to for like a week. While they were they had like an evaluation period. Unless they were somebody who was medically, physically impaired, then they went where they needed to go immediately. But for everyone else, that's where you go for the first week or so. At the beginning, you'll be under pretty strict observation, and then it'll be evaluated.
Yeah, the 2 weeks of observation with youth villages and in foster care, specifically with group homes and residentials, that was the thing that drove me absolutely insane. Just...
Why so?
I can tell you about that. When I went to Wallace, and it was my PPV, pre-placement visit. It's basically where you go and they see, are we going to take you? They just monitor how you adjust, things like that. Probably the biggest reason they do this is because when people come from a residential that's really locked up to a group home that's less like restrictive, they immediately run, or they try to immediately run, and then they decide, we don't want you here, and they bump you back to the residential. It's 2 weeks, but basically the first couple days are the most extreme, because when I was first there in my PPV, that was when they were really doing the observation, because there's a chance I could just run.
Right.
I remember specifically it was me and this other girl, and we were both, we didn't know this at the time, but we were both actually competing for the same bed. I don't know why they did this. I was there for an entire year after that, and they never did it again. But it was one cot, and then there was the couch. And it was me and this one girl. 2 places to sleep. One of them smelled like piss.
Right.
So it was very interesting, and the cot had apparently come from one of the really high-level facilities in Memphis that Youth Villages owns. And so it was like, we just kind of played rock, paper, scissors. She lost, but then they actually put her in a room, which was nice for her. And I think I slept on the bed that didn't smell like pee, because you have to... I should probably preface this with, when you first get there, you have to sleep in basically the staff area upstairs, because they want to monitor you while you are sleeping to make sure you're not doing anything and make sure you're not messing with anybody. It's just really difficult, because I remember this. I was trying to sleep, and the staff were typing their notes. They had their lights on. The phone was going. All of that. It was very stressful, and I just come to that place. But yeah, that's kind of the draw in, because you're talking about this adjustment period where you're being observed, and I was like, I remember that.
And it's that you said you were trying to sleep and staff was typing and they had their lights on and talking. I was assigned one-on-one to somebody, and in one of these one-person rooms, you're assigned, you've got to be with them. So he's going to sleep. I'm sitting, closer than you and I are sitting now. And I've got my laptop on. And he's like, hey, man, I'm trying to sleep. Can you, I'm like, oh, I didn't. Okay, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it's not a natural thing to do. It didn't feel great to be watching like that.
You received restraint training while at Fairfax. Right. This was the second time. How did that go?
It went like I said before. You sit in a room, you watch videos, you talk, you walk through exercises, you walk through restraints. This is where the trainer who was dedicated to I'm going to show you what this is really like was. And they were really good because they had worked the floor for a long time and they knew what it was like. And they knew that just walking through a choreographed dance isn't preparing you for it.
Is there something specific you think that makes restraint training work better?
I think being confronted with the reality of the situation is important. Being confronted, having to observe or see or go through something that approximates the real experience of restraining somebody in a chaotic, unpredictable situation, somebody who does not want to be restrained, that you are physically coercing them, I think that makes it go better. Because we can talk about a situation and say that this is going to be happening. I can describe it, but to be in the room where it's happening is different. To be confronted with the idea that this is happening here and now, and you are going to have to do this. I think that makes it more effective.
When you look up pictures online of restraints, they're not really representative. They're very still, they're very choreographed, like you were saying. I don't think there's anything that can really prepare you, because like you were saying, where you're going through this training, I remember when I was at my last foster home, I was actually talking to basically my youth village's therapist. She was basically a woman who came and checked on me every week and talked to me and tried to help me with skills and talking to my foster parents and making sure that things in the house were going okay. Nobody was fighting, and kind of to mediate if there was an argument. And she was very helpful. She was very straightforward with me, and she was very influential, and she actually wanted to help me. I did not know what was going on, but I knew that I was getting towards the end of family foster care. And I was starting to make that sort of transition of, we don't know where to put you, right? So she sat me down and she was explaining restraints to me. And it prepared me in a way of knowing what it would look like. So that way when I walked into those doors and saw someone getting restrained, I knew, oh, this is what's happening, right? But it doesn't prepare you for the crying, the screaming, the spitting, the punching, the hitting. When it does get out of control, or when it's basically a fight with some extra precautions. She was great, but she could not have possibly prepared me for it in any way. Because she did sit me down and was yeah, they can put their hands on you, it might happen, you might see this, you might see that. But I was that is just it's hard to actually picture that, because outside of these residentials, we don't really have a good comparison point.
Right, it's a very intense situation. It is a fight that you are diffusing. It is an actual intense, and like I said earlier, people, like you said, people will scream, people will spit, people will claw at your skin, and you will bleed. You might get bitten. One of the things that the training tells you is, if you're bitten, if somebody's biting you, what do? And the idea is that you feed the bite. You push it into them so that, they're not pulling away from you and, ripping a chunk of flesh out of you. Imagine being in the room where that's happening. Imagine being the person that's happening to. And it's a stressful thought. For minimum wage, Serena.
How did your coworkers treat restraints?
There was a mix. Some of us, it freaked us out. We didn't want to do them. We did them when we had to, but we weren't happy. Some people were ready to go. What would happen is we had walkie-talkies. Not everyone did. Some people, I think the shift leads did. And a hold would start. The process was like this. A situation escalates, a hold is initiated, the person who's doing the hold starts shouting assistance. They don't start shouting help, because help is the universal come to help me, and that could be anybody talking. Assistance is specifically a hold is happening and I, the staff member, need assistance. So if staff hears assistance being shouted, your job is to sprint to that location and do it. And jump in. Whatever's going on, you help the staff member. The shift lead will get on the walkie-talkie and say, hey, assistance to... Each unit had a name. There were some people who were, it seemed like, eager to do it. Maybe it was just they had a good sense of duty and they knew that they had to jump in and help. But when I say sprint, I mean, like, drop everything and sprint. These people, these individuals were just like gone. They were ready to go. And as far as attitudes towards restraints go, I don't want to say that anybody was actively I'm gonna hold them. I'm gonna restrain somebody. I wouldn't say that anybody visibly relished it. But there were people who were more cavalier and more willing and had no qualms about doing it. I'm not inside anybody's head. And this isn't a conversation that we had as staff members, how we felt about doing this. Because it was just a requirement of the job. Like, you were told that this is what you were going to do. You do it. It scared the piss out of me. I'll say that. Non-confrontational. I wanted a chill time. I didn't want to have to be put in this position.
Tell me a bit about the specific restraint method used at Fairfax.
So, I mentioned the arm hold. That was used a lot. The two-person hold that I mentioned wasn't. Never used that there. Wasn't trained on it. What they did use was a chair hold. And this hold had something like 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 5 people at a time involved in this hold. What would happen is a situation would escalate, a hold is initiated. It would start typically with this arm hold, this cross-body hold. Assistance would be shouted. Somebody else would come and take somebody's other arm. So you have 2 staff members holding one client by each arm. A third staff member would grab a chair and bring it behind the client. The 2 staff members holding their arms would place their hands on the person's shoulder and push them down into the chair. Then the person who is behind would take over holding them by the shoulders. Each person on the side would kneel next to the chair with their arm. A third person sometimes would come and restrain their legs. And then there is a 5th person, perhaps, who gets a towel and holds it in front of their face so that if they decide to spit, it doesn't go anywhere. It was only maybe a couple times that I recall, if at all, somebody with the towel. So we've got one person on either side, one person behind, one person in front, and another person holding a towel in front of the client's face. So the person behind is intended, I think the main purpose of that is to stabilize the chair. So that if the client, the person who's being held, tries to go backwards, it doesn't tip backwards. This hold is to be held until they are no longer agitated, which means not physically struggling to get out of it. They're quote unquote calm. That means that this could go for a while, and you could be holding somebody who's pretty strong. So there would be other staff members around. And if you are holding someone and you're like, I can't do this anymore, you could tap out and somebody would take your place. And this could go on for a while.
Tell me about Grant. What was he like?
When I got there, he was in the behavioral unit. And he was like he was kind of a guy, just a guy. I want to say like down to earth, like a real kind of person. Like I kind of felt like he could see that this was all bullshit. And part of me respected that. He didn't really kind of respect the rules that much, which is fine because some of them were actually bullshit. One of them was you're not supposed to sleep in the common room. You go back to your room to sleep. But he would come out and sit in the common room and just sit in a chair and just fall asleep. Is this the time that you want me to tell that story?
Yes.
Okay. So Grant had these behavioral issues. At Fairfax, there was a big deal about cigarettes. If you came in and you smoked, you were almost invariably put on some sort of plan to stop smoking. Which meant that your cigarettes were kept in a locked room with all the medication, and you got like one an hour, one every 2 hours, that kind of thing. Grant was on this kind of plan. One day, he wanted his cigarette. And I think it was time, or very close to time. And staff wasn't getting it for him. Like they were, I don't remember the exact situation, they were like waving it off, like, oh, we'll get it in a second, I'm doing something. Give me just a minute. And Grant started getting upset. It's like, I want my cigarette. Because you don't smoke. But when you want a cigarette, you want a cigarette. And if you are being forced to quit, and you're not on board with it, this is not fun. So he was getting upset. And this escalated to the point where he was being like verbally and physically like getting in people's space. And I won't lie, when he got like this, he was an intimidating person and it was scary to be in his presence. So a hold was initiated. He got restrained. And this was one of those chair holds that like 5 people were involved in, and people were rotating in and out. Like, because the hold started, you support, you're just there, you do it. Like, the general feeling I got was that we kind of all understood that this didn't need to happen. Like, he had a request. And that need wasn't being met. That reasonable request wasn't being met. But that because it escalated, and maybe somebody was just more ready to go to the hold because it was escalating and like there was agitation in the air, it felt like it didn't need to happen. Like, I got a bad feeling about that one. I got a bad feeling about all of them for the most part, but that one in particular, it felt like there was another way to do things. I don't want to say that the person who started it, the staff member who started the hold, I don't want to say that they were malicious in any way. It was a situation where things were escalating and they felt like, okay, this is go time. And they did it. Like I said, intimidating guy, if he's getting up in your space, that kind of thing. But it could have earlier on been met appropriately. He didn't want a lot. It didn't feel right to happen that time.
What happened when Grant was finally let go?
I remember him being like, fuck you. Everyone kind of went away to write their incident reports. When something like this happens, everyone involved writes an incident report. They write down what they experienced in detached, disinterested terms. Not like, I showed up and I was like, oh my god, But I arrived at 6:30 p.m. I observed this. I did this. And then this happened at this time, and so on. Those all get compiled, and they go to the behavior analysts and management to look over.
It's a very professional document.
It's supposed to be, yeah.
But Grant isn't represented in this directly, as in, he doesn't have a say in that, of course, because he's the client, he's the patient.
Right. He doesn't write an incident report. There was a mechanism for clients to register complaints. It was a form that they could ask to have access to and fill out and ask for help filling it out. I don't know what happened with those. But for somebody who is, like, in this facility against their will, who's just being restrained, is impaired in one way or another, but for it to be like, are you upset with what's just happened? Here, fill out this form, and we'll investigate. I don't know. That doesn't feel great. That doesn't feel adequate.
So at the end of this shift, you go home.
Yeah.
What happened?
When I went home that night, I go home, I eat, I do whatever entertainment thing I was doing at the time, watching things on YouTube or whatever. I go to sleep, and I get ready to do it again tomorrow.
So, tell me a bit about Ace.
Ace is an individual at the Fairfax facility. He was one of these people that had a one-on-one. I liked working with him because he was fun. He liked wrestling. He liked Pokemon. And I could just kind of play with him. And the shift would go by quick. When I first encountered him, he was also at the behavioral unit. He eventually moved on. One day, he threw a cup at my head. And it connected, so I can't remember which side, but like around the temple. And this was very early. I think this might have been my first week, or the first 2 weeks or something. It was like a plastic cup. A little bit of heft to it. Not like a solo cup, but like one that you would put in your kitchen cabinet. He was angry. I was like, oh, I don't know what. And he picked up a cup, threw it at my head, hit me in the temple. I was fine. I was just kind of like dazed for a second. So what's supposed to happen after you get injured on the job, after you get assaulted, is you get sent to urgent care to get checked out. That didn't happen that time. I don't know why. I think I was just like, yeah, I'm okay. It didn't occur to anybody to send me out. The other times that I got assaulted on the job, I did go to urgent care. And then later I went home and I was watching TV with my roommate, feeling kind of good about the day. And I realized that I couldn't see out of my left eye. You know when you get a migraine, like that phosphine, like you just lose vision? And if it's not accompanied with like a headache, like pain, that can just happen and you don't notice. But watching TV, I was like, oh, am I concussed? I can't see. I did the thing where I'm like, oh yeah, if my hand goes down there, I can't see it anymore without moving my eye. But later, he got moved to the other unit, and I think that was after I moved. I was moved there too. And we would hang out and play, and nothing like that ever happened again. I don't think he remembered that. It was just an outburst. I liked him. He was like one of my favorite people to work with.
Did you ever have any long-term or significant injuries from working this job?
I've alluded to it. I got punched in the face. I was out of work for like a week. That is why I got moved from one unit to another. because the person who punched me in the face was going to remain on that unit, and I couldn't be in that space anymore. What happened was, it was the middle of the night. I was sitting in a chair outside this guy's room. He did not want me there. He came out. I was like, hey, you've got to move. You got to get out of here. And I was like, I can't. This is my job. I did not catch his eye. I did not stand up. I was just like, don't. Just try and get through this. He kept saying things like, you've got to get out of here. Move. Get out. I was like, I can't. Look, man, I've just got to be here. And I guess I didn't pick up on the signs. I didn't understand what was going on. I learned through this experience that you want to be standing when these things escalate. You don't want to try and ignore it. You want to face it and keep your wits about you. Because I was sitting down and he just, bam, right in the eye. And I couldn't dodge because I was just there, trapped in the chair. I managed to get up and get away from him, and I started shouting, assistance, assistance. And nobody was coming. And he was following me around this common area. And I was like backing away and dodging, shouting, assistance, assistance. And he was still coming at me. And I basically fled to the other side of the unit where the other staff members were like watching TV with a client or two. And it's like, fucking assistance. And they're like, oh my God. And sprang up and like got between me and this guy. We're human, and I have just been punched in the face. I am not really being stoic in this moment. Like, I remember saying, you got what you wanted. I'm out. I'm gone. And the other staff trying to calm me down, as well as just separate us. So I got sent to urgent care, and the doctor was like, yeah, you're going to be out for 2 days, unless you'd like to be out for more. Like, sympathetically, like, do you want to get back to work, or do you just not want to go back? I was like, well, I've got to work eventually, but give me, 4 days.
It can be rough like that.
Yeah.
Do you think a person's environment affects the need for restraints?
Yeah, I do. I've been using terms like agitation and escalation. Like, restraints are a response to somebody having certain behaviors. And those behaviors are a response to, like, emotional and cognitive circumstances. Like, if I'm upset, I'm more likely to be physically aggressive. And my environment plays a huge role in that. Like, if I'm in a comfortable environment, I'm going to be more chill. If I'm, like, in a medical setting, a clinical, like, linoleum floors and cots type of always under observation, I'm going to be on edge. And, like, the way that people behave around you is also your environment, is also, like, super important. Like, ideally, like I said, these restraints are a response to particular behaviors. And those behaviors have antecedents. And those antecedents are knowable. Like, if Grant had gotten his cigarette, that wouldn't have escalated. If people had been able to talk to him and, like, made him feel like, yeah, we're trying, instead of kind of brushing him off. I think the physical environment at Fairfax was as good as it could be. The behavioral unit was a lot more clinical. It wasn't great. Like, it felt like detention. But other areas felt more homely. And those other areas didn't have as many behaviors.
What do you think mental health facilities can do or implement to make the environments better and more calming to try to prevent the restraints from happening in the first place?
They need to feel like comfortable environments, like a home, like being able to have space to yourself, isolated space. Like at Fairfax, one of the units was basically just like a little apartment dorm thing, and they were very cozy rooms with a bedroom and a living room, their own ensuite bathrooms. It felt like you had your own place. Those people were less likely to become agitated. I think also having staff members who are like tuned in to the fact that like you're just interacting with people. This isn't just a job.
I think what strikes me is what you said, the difference between the behavioral unit and the higher functioning unit.
Right.
Obviously, less furniture, less things to throw around, but there's that balance of, well, this feels clinical and sterilized and isolating.
Right. If you feel like a bug under a microscope, that's going to put you on edge. If you don't have privacy, you're going to be if you don't have some sense that you are still your own person, it makes sense that you're going to lash out just to try and get some sense of control over your life. Everything about your day is regimented, and you are always being watched. Smoking is like a coping skill. It's like a coping mechanism. Like, what is it? You used to see it in movies, not so much anymore. It's like something, like a huge traumatic thing happens and somebody lights, like, oh my god, they light up a cigarette. If you're in this environment where like, holy shit, like being here is a traumatic event. And they are also taking away this coping skill, this coping mechanism. But the one thing they can't take away is how you respond to it.
There's definitely that same thing going on with the kids. We don't get cigarettes, obviously.
Right.
Like, no cigarettes for us, but it's the same principle of your coping skills get taken away. And they're not even something that could be viewed as quote-unquote negative. It's just, the thing around it is they need to put limits on things because they need as most control as possible on the situation. But then you get issues like, my coping skill when I was in foster care was music. I loved my music so much, and that was all I did all day when I was in traditional foster care. I would go to school, go home, and I would listen to my music for like as long as I possibly could, as long as they would allow me. When you get into a group home or residential, in residentials you're lucky if you get an hour of music each week. Same with group homes, you might get a little more, but it's basically, I was there for many months and I finally got myself a cheap little iPod, and I could finally listen to the radio, and I loved doing that. I loved the music, but it was still like limitations and rules. You couldn't listen to certain kinds of music. You couldn't play explicit music out loud. You couldn't listen to explicit music unless computer time in your earbuds, but that was only for an hour on the weekends if you were allowed, right? And so it's like, okay, well, you're taking away all of these things that are normal in my life that I'm used to, and you're gonna expect that to go well? Like, I don't know, man. Like, and that's the other thing. I think that if you take a regular person and you take away all the stuff they're gonna like, they're going to do the same thing.
Yeah, it's really easy to predict that like people are going to be irritated and angry.
Tell me how Fairfax made sure to be accountable when doing restraints.
So there were two main things that I would point to. The first is the incident reports. Like I said, everybody involved, there was a specific sheet, and like as soon as the thing happened and you got a chance, you sat down and you wrote out an incident report, and you did it in a disinterested way. One restraint might have 5 to 10 reports. Everybody who was involved would write something. Everything from the person who initiated the hold to somebody who was just like in the room when it happened. So management got 10 reports on a thing from 10 different perspectives, and they could read them all and put together a picture of what happened. And they were all supposed to be written from a disinterested point of view, describing behavior, not ascribing motivation or emotion to anybody, just describing physically what happened. I think that that's good. And then there were cameras everywhere. I think the only places on campus where there weren't cameras were people's individual rooms, and like in the bathrooms. Everywhere else was covered. The parking lot, the common areas, the hallways. So when a restraint occurred, these incident reports would be written up, including the time and the location, and it would be the responsibility of the behavior analysts to pull up that footage and watch it unfold and to see what happened. And people were held accountable. Like, you would be called into the office to explain what happened from your perspective. So it isn't as though everyone's word was just taken as read. People would check and see what happened. I can see how it would be really easy for it to go wrong if there isn't accountability.
Do you think there's anything that should have been expanded on? Anything, anywhere that they could have done better?
As far as specifically restraints go, I don't know. I think some sort of reconciliation moment, or speaking with the person who was restrained about what happened, might be beneficial. I don't know that there can be some sort of truth and reconciliation where you get the person who was held and the holder together and they hash it out, bury the hatchet. I don't know. I think that the way that Fairfax did it was pretty... Not being an expert, I think that it was as good as it could be hoped. I think that the failing is that you have just people who are in a job and have all the attachment to the job of like a fast food worker. It's a rough job, and it's not treated with the respect that it deserves. And I think that means that the people who are doing it feel that they aren't valued, and they just do the minimum to engage.
What does the most ethical restraint look like to you?
The most ethical restraint to me looks like one that is used only when violence is imminent. I think it's used as minimally as possible, for as short a time as possible. I think the least restrictive holds are used that are necessary. When it's over, it's over as quickly as possible. Separate the people who were involved so that tempers don't flare and it recurs.
Do you think, with your experience doing restraints, that there is something missing in the way that we're doing them?
Empathy. There has to be some sort of dissociation in order to do the job long term. I think remembering that this sucks for everybody is a piece that could be added.
And there is no real alternative in the way that if somebody isn't restrained when they really need to be, people will get physically hurt.
Right.
More than if they had just been restrained. And some of the other alternatives that I've heard of, like sedating someone, that's a lot more that's medicine that you're putting in a person.
That is more unethical.
Yeah.
I think one of the struggles that I have with this topic is the idea that it is necessary in certain contexts. There are people and there are times when a punch is going to be thrown, somebody is going to get hurt, and you need to be able to physically intervene to stop that from happening. You do need to. Everyone's going through a traumatic experience. They're not going to be at their best. They're not going to be saintly and respond to, let's just talk this out, necessarily. There are times when violence occurs and you need to be able to physically prevent that from happening. And with the idea that this is just a job and you're getting people who are kind of desperate for money, and it wasn't particularly difficult to get the job. Like, I wasn't the healthiest person at the time. I was dealing with my own trauma, my own internal bullshit. There's no way that didn't bleed out into the work.
Tell me about where you were in your life when you were working at Fairfax.
It wasn't great. I'm originally from Tennessee. I had hit what I thought was rock bottom, and I left the state just trying to escape. I was very confused and very hurt and very lost, very traumatized, and I didn't really know that. I was very depressed. I knew that. And I had this vague notion that, because I had received I had gotten a bachelor's in psychology, but in order to actually do anything in the field, you need a master's. So at some point, I would have to go back to school. But in order for me to do that, I would have to have something on my resume that looked good. And believing that this kind of work was psychology adjacent, at least, I was like, well, I'm not ready to go back to school now. I kind of just want to survive and grind and just make it through the day. But if I get a job that is kind of just like grunt work, but in a field that is kind of adjacent, it'll look good in 5, 8, 10 years when I finally pull the trigger and go back to school. I didn't know the depths that I was still in, but it was not a good time. I was running. And you can never actually run away from yourself.
Do you think doing restraints fueled your depression?
Yeah. I think it fueled my anxiety and my stress. It didn't make things better. What I needed was to feel safe, like I could relax. But being in that situation specifically was a matter of always being panicked and looking over your shoulder and being ready for it to go down, which meant that I couldn't relax. It just didn't end. It put me in a bad place in my relationships, always wanting to shut down and not have to deal with the world, not have to deal with the stress of other people.
Is there anything that would have made doing restraints better for you as a staff?
Acknowledging that this was hard. Like, we had therapists on campus. Like, maybe we could get some therapy. Maybe we could actually talk about this and acknowledge that this is kind of fucked up.
At Fairfax, do you think that there was an us and them mentality, as in staff, the clients?
For some people, yeah. I know that for me, I kind of took refuge in that idea. I identified pretty strongly with some of the people who were there. I kind of had to think of it like, I'm here and you're there, and there's a difference. I don't think it's true for everybody. But I think that there are people who really did think us and them. And I think on the part of the clients, they could tell which people had that attitude.
And the people you worked with ultimately aren't just passive objects in this. They have their own thoughts, and they can determine who is really in it.
Right.
And who really cares.
Right. Who gives a shit and who is just kind of an asshole.
What do you think facilities in general can do to help people who are actually going through these restraints?
I think debriefing and therapy and basically like apologizing. Like this is a necessary evil.
And thank you for touching on that. Because there are genuinely situations where you have the best intentions, but a restraint goes wrong. And I feel like if staff were to just acknowledge that fact, that they messed up, they fucked up, it would be so much less tense in these group homes and residentials.
Right.
Because let me tell you something. When two kids fought in these group homes, right? Sometimes it would be like you resent each other for a little bit, and then you just kind of get along again because you're in the same house. You can't get away from each other. Let's just drop it, right? There's an unspoken thing. But sometimes it really is genuine, like, I am sorry. Like, these kids who are up to 13 years old will look at each other and be like, I'm sorry. I hit you. That wasn't right of me. I need to apologize. And then the other person will apologize too. That genuinely does happen in these group homes and residentials. But it doesn't happen when a staff hurts a kid. Never. You never get an apology. It's never, I'm sorry you have to witness that. I'm sorry that this happened to you. Or even just this is why.
Right. Just move on. Don't talk about it. Don't acknowledge it. But like accountability for people who are doing the holds. Because like this is super sensitive and it can go wrong. Like reprimands and maybe firing people. Definitely firing people.
Yeah, I've seen some people who really like they needed to be fired and there was no accountability. And I feel like there just needs to be an environment where it's like expected to actually talk. And I feel like for some people, like if you were to talk about the incident, it would reveal things that would prevent future restraints.
Probably, yeah.
And so I feel like if there was sort of like a debriefing where you talk out what happens with the actual person who is in the restraint, obviously once tensions have calmed down a little bit and the person can be rational, if that person can be rational, it might reveal why it even happened, and it might be completely different than what the staff were thinking. And it might be conductive to prevent future restraints if you just sit down with somebody and talk about what happened. Because I know that my chart and my medical records, I've read them. I've pulled up my Youth Village's records. I've read through them. I've sludged through all 400, 500 pages of them.
Wow.
Oh yeah, every single thing was recorded even when I wasn't there. If they had a group and I wasn't there for physical therapy, they recorded it. Yeah, it was insanely long document, and I was only in Youth Village's care for like a year and 5 months. Everything was very documented. I sledged through all of that, and they didn't catch half the things that were going on. The incidents with staff that were going on that were causing a lot of my issues and a lot of my stress weren't being addressed because nobody the staff weren't directly involved with it. It was, I would complain to my therapist, and then it would just get written up in the notes, and the therapist would try to talk with me and regulate my stuff, but the environment wouldn't change.
Right.
She would just expect me to change.
I think that you're touching on something too. Like they didn't catch things. There are things that go unreported, but like people know happened, and then they just didn't write down. I think the idea of covering your ass covers a lot of ground here. It's like, if I don't talk about this, nobody can hold me accountable. Nobody can punish me. I won't get in trouble.
Tell me a bit about burnout. That's something I've heard about a lot, specifically with mental health providers. Do you think that that was an issue at Fairfax?
I do. I think that it's a high-stress environment, and there's a certain level of being jaded that you have to maintain in order to, work there long-term. There's really high turnover in places like this because of how low the pay is and how high stress it is. People don't want to deal with it. You will burn out pretty quick unless you put up your walls and you sort of detach. And that's a problem because, the requirements of the job are pretty intense. And you can't do them if you're just kind of detached and doing the bare minimum. And if you've got huge turnover, you've got new people coming in every month or two. Mental health stuff is about relationships. Developing trust, therapeutic relationships and a relationship of trust. If there's a new person every 2 months, okay, cool, you're the new guy. All right, cool. I'll see, whatever. I don't care. Yeah, it's a problem.
For both the staff and the people.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. The way that I've kind of described restraints to people who have never been in them is, imagine you've got your 2 fingers stuck in one of those Chinese finger traps, right? Your instant reaction is to pull.
Mm-hmm.
But if you pull, you'll never get out of that Chinese finger trap. You're just going to get stuck. The way that it works is counterintuitive to your gut feeling. When you're in restraint, your body hurts. The first thing you try to do is get away from that pain. Because you're struggling, they keep restraining you. And eventually it just goes until you're tired. And with the Chinese finger trap, it's one part of your body that is trapped. But when you're restrained, it's your whole person. And that's why that is the concept that I think explains it the best to people who know nothing, is your natural instincts. You have to kind of be this person who flaunts them and gets rid of those and tries to stay calm in this situation that's very high stakes. You're in a lot of pain. And nobody really tells you that little survival tip when you walk in the door of, hey, restraints are like a Chinese finger trap. You need to do the opposite of what you think.
I've never thought about it like that, but that makes a lot of sense. When we used restraints, it was until they stop struggling. But they want out. So your instinct is to struggle, to try and fight to get out, not to just relax. And it feels super demeaning and dehumanizing. To be held in a trap and reduced to that fight or flight instinct. I'd fight.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really think that your perspective is important and needs to be heard. I don't think that people often think, let alone talk about, what the actual people working in foster care go through and how restraints can really weigh on them specifically.
Well, my pleasure. This is a difficult thing for me to talk about. It was a dark time in my life, and it is not a job that I am particularly proud of having done. But I'm glad that I can help.
Hey y'all. Before you go, I just want to talk to you real quick about a study that I found called Restraint Use in Residential Programs. Why are best practices ignored? This study is really interesting. It talks a bit about organizations that have reduced their reliance on restraints and have implemented other measures to try to prevent them from happening. One program that reduced its restraints, the Grafton School in Virginia, did so by creating a program-specific action plan to reduce restraint use and rely on other core strategies. They found a 99% reduction in restraint, an 83% reduction in staff injuries, and economic benefits such as less workers' comp claims, less liability premiums, and less staff turnover. Another organization, the Andrus Children's Center in New York, studied their restraints and found that inexperienced staff were more likely to get injured when they were actually involved in restraints. So they made a new rule that said, hey, staff, you can only do restraints once you've been here for 3 months. So the newer staff, they couldn't do any restraints. After implementing that new rule and training, staff turnover decreased by 50% and restraint use dropped by 93%. So what did these organizations actually do? It's really fascinating because they actually implemented debriefing. They talked to the children involved and they changed treatment plans and even agency policies. They created comfort and sensory rooms. They talked to children about how to recognize what triggers them and how to self-soothe. In this next part, I just need to directly quote this study because it is so impactful. I cannot even understate how amazing this is. Leadership must provide guidance to staff to suspend institutional rules when necessary to avoid or resolve conflicts when addressing individual needs. Examples of possible rule suspension scenarios include attendance at activities, wake and sleep times, using points and level systems, and other practices that do not adequately take into account individual needs, trauma history, and emotional, behavioral, or cognitive challenges. Staff should be empowered to make decisions in the moment to avoid using restraints and seclusions. So what does this all mean? It means looking at the residents of a group home, of a residential, and seeing them as a person. It means looking at them and saying, what do you need? What are we not doing correctly? Let's change things to fit you, instead of you having to change to fit all of this. It means talking to them and listening to what they have to say and adjusting rules and procedures when you can to help them feel more regulated, to help them feel like they're at home. Let's approach these teenagers and say, hey, what do you actually need? Like, why are you getting in so many restraints? Why are you getting in so many seclusions? Talk to them. Try to build trust. It means giving them control over their life. They've already been moved around. They've already been separated from their family and their community. Let's try to give them something back as opposed to just taking away. I think personally, with my group home, one of my big struggles was asking for the things that I needed. First of all, I was already used to providing for myself. At least I would go in the kitchen and get myself a glass of water when I was outside of foster care. But in a group home, you have to ask to do that. You have to ask to go to the bathroom. Your shower is limited. Everything is controlled for you. And I wasn't used to that. And on top of that, the staff at that point were strangers to me. And suddenly these strangers dictated every aspect of my life. And on top of that, the first 3 weeks, I witnessed multiple restraints in my group home. That doesn't allow me to build trust when I'm seeing my staff physically hurting someone who's my age and knowing that that is coming for me next. It's common sense. So I approached my therapist and I was like, hey, I'm having issues asking for if I need a glass of water or if I need to go to the bathroom. It makes me very anxious. I get tense and I can't relax like this. And so she told me, okay, well, every day you're going to ask for something that you need, and that's going to be your goal working for the next couple months. I feel like it would have been more effective if my therapist approached me and said, okay, well, let's see what we can do to help you build trust with those staff. And actually dove deep with me and said, well, why don't you trust your staff? What have they been doing? What have you been seeing? What can they change and fix to help bond with you? And then the other aspect is, well, why can't I go in the kitchen and just grab myself a glass of water? I'm not a flight risk. There's no need to restrict me like that. I'm not a self-harm risk, so they don't need to have their eyes on me 24/7. So why? Why not question that and try to meet the kid where they're at? Because I feel like for me, that would have helped tremendously in my stay and to help me build trust with my staff and feel like I could relax in the first month when I was there. My final point with this as to why it's so important to meet kids where they're at, reduce the restraints, see what else we can do to help kids soothe their behaviors and prevent these emotional outbursts that these kids are having is because it avoids dangerous situations. When you get into a restraint, things can go bad so fast. I've seen people go to the emergency room, both staff and kids. I've seen people get blood all over the walls. It is not good. It is really dangerous. So, in the grand scheme of things, adjusting the rules that you can adjust seems like a lot of a better option versus bleeding all over, or getting hurt, or getting your nerves pinched, or your arms twisted. I want to say thank you to the authors of this study. I really do. It's nice to age out and see that there are people in my corner. There are people who are advocating for the things that I needed when I was a teenager.